The podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redaphid.com. And distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular audio podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, NORMLAudiostash.com. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. Welcome back to the Audio Stash this Wednesday. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to end marijuana prohibition in America. Just visit NORML.org. Today we'll hear part one of our special series highlighting the 1972 Schaefer Commission. We'll be back with our regular segments with Dr. Mitch Earlywine next week, and we'll hear a short interview with Mitch on Friday's Audio Stash. Also, our free stuff giveaway is still happening. You have until midnight tonight to submit your entries to free stuff at NORMLAudiostash.com. We're giving away a brand new copy of Ron Mann's Grass DVD, narrated by Woody Harrelson. You can have a chance to win. Just send an email to freestuff at NORMLAudiostash.com. Now let's get to part one of our special series on the Schaefer Commission. In tomorrow's part two special, we'll hear portions of the White House tapes never before made available digitally. And in part one today, we'll explore the creation of the commission, the only congressional commission to explore marijuana in America. This week, folks, marks one of the most important and unfortunate milestones in the history of marijuana in America, the 35th anniversary of the final report by the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission. This commission was established by Congress, and their final report was subtitled Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding. We're devoting 2 full programs on the Audio Stash this week to the Commission. We'll explore the history of the Commission and its recommendations with NORML's founder, Keith Strupp, NORML's Executive Director, Alan St. Pierre, Dr. Thomas Ungerleider, who is a member of the Commission, and with the voices of President Nixon and his staff, through the WhiteHouseTapes.org project at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. 35 years later, the Commission's recommendations still mark the best starting point for a decriminalized and practical approach to marijuana in American society. American marijuana consumers should remember this date, March 21st, 1972, a brisk spring day, just like this one in Washington, D.C., when the head of the Marijuana and Substance Abuse Commission, Raymond Schaefer, met with President Nixon and his staff and discovered the reality of the White House position on pot. The question of why marijuana is illegal and categorized the way that it is today. With all of the consequences of modern law enforcement, judicial and prison costs, which all pale in comparison to the human cost of Prohibition, really can, in most ways, be traced back to these 2 days in March 1972, when President Nixon had the chance to move marijuana away from other drugs in the newly created Controlled Substances Act. But instead of heeding the pragmatism outlined by the Commission, their report was dismissed and none of the recommendations acted upon. I asked Keith Strupp, the founder of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, if the dismissal of this report by the White House then was truly the origin of the modern form of marijuana prohibition.
Oh, without question. If they would have even lowered marijuana to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, remember, the reason marijuana was put in Schedule 1, according to the legislative history of the Controlled Substances Act, is because they were creating the National Commission, and they said, we'll put it in Schedule 1 for now, but as soon as the Commission comes back with their recommendations, we'll lower it to the appropriate schedule. Well, the Commission came back, but of course the Congress had no will, or at least the majority of the members of Congress had no will to move it. So here we are 35 years later, and marijuana is still classified in Schedule 1, and two of the criteria for Schedule 1 is, one is a high potential for abuse, and the second is no known medical use. Well, my goodness, marijuana is the safest drug ever known to man. No one has ever died from smoking marijuana, and there's even some expert testimony suggesting that in order to have a lethal dose, you would have to ingest 1,500 pounds of marijuana in a 15-minute period. And even those who smoke a lot, I think, would have that. It'd be very difficult to reach that level. So, you know, you lose maybe 30,000 people a year in this country from alcohol overdose. You have 430,000 people a year die from cigarette smoking, and no one's ever died from marijuana. So clearly, on a relative level, marijuana has a low potential for abuse, not high. Secondly, we now know, of course, that marijuana is somewhat of a miracle drug for seriously ill patients, for MS patients and HIV patients and ALS patients and lots of others. So it's misclassified, but because of a lack of political will, it still sits in Schedule 1. And much of the debate we hear in the country right now over the medical use of marijuana and whether it's valid or whether it isn't, if they would have reclassified it back in 1972 or 3 when they should have, physicians it would be legal for physicians to prescribe marijuana. It could be distributed through pharmacy. You wouldn't have these awkward situations like the Angel Race case or the Ed Rosenthal case out in California. It could have been handled in an ordinary and routine manner. So the failure of Congress to follow up on this commission is really a sad statement.
Like a drug which is harmful and wrong. Like a drug which is harmful and wrong. Like a drug which is harmful and wrong.
The history of the Commission, how it was formed, and those who participated in it include many familiar names in politics today. Keith tells us about those players.
This commission was established by Congress. It was a section of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And what happened is Nixon had pushed through this terrible Controlled Substances Act, which I might add remains on the books yet today. It still is a terrible act. But perhaps the only positive thing in the entire act was that former Congressman Ed Koch was successful in getting introduced and getting incorporated a provision to create the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. Congressman Koch, when he was in Congress, was a very progressive member. He subsequently, people may remember, retired from Congress and became mayor of New York, and he wasn't so liberal when he was the mayor of New York. But we certainly are in his debt for getting the provision in to create the commission. Now, under the terms of the commission, the Congress appointed half the members and President Nixon appointed the other half. So when it was first set up, we were great skeptics here at NORML. We thought that the Congress was simply going to put people on the commission who were going to reaffirm their preconceived prejudices, and we did not expect very much from it. When we first approached the commission and asked if we could testify, they told us to get lost. I mean, in no uncertain terms. It wasn't even very with a lot of courtesy. It was kind of a rude, we're not interested in NORML or what you have to say. So at any event, I then went to former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who I'd begun to work with when I was establishing NORML, and asked Ramsey if he would be willing to testify on our behalf to the commission, because I thought, gee, surely the commission couldn't turn down a former Attorney General. Well, wrong again. They said they weren't interested in hearing from NORML or Ramsey Clark, and they'd decide who was going to testify, and we should leave them alone. So naturally, we started off thinking that this is a commission that's probably not going to come out with any conclusions that we're going to like. Now, real quickly, let me point out that as they began to hold their hearings and things began to move along, we were able to get Jack Anderson to include a column. Jack Anderson used to be a famous columnist in the Washington Post, and he loved to catch public officials when they were doing something that didn't make sense. And so when I shared with Jack Anderson the fact that they had told us to get lost and the former Attorney General, they very quickly changed their position. Within 24 hours, I had been invited to testify, and so had former Attorney General Ramsey Clark. Now, as it turns out, there were a number of really interesting people on there. Now, there were some that were, as we expected, that had a prejudice against marijuana, and they weren't going to let the facts get in the way. But there were people like Dr. Tom Ungerleider, who I know you've interviewed and will be part of this program, who was a physician at UCLA and was a drug expert and was very modern and progressive in his attitudes. And subsequently, we became friends. And after the commission was finished, he used to go around and testify on the state level in support of the commission's recommendations. In addition, there was a woman named Joan Gantz Cooney. She was the chief person responsible for the children's program Sesame Street. When my daughter was young, she grew up on Sesame Street, and Joan Cooney was the creator of that program. Now, one might thought that because it was a children's program that she would be very anti-marijuana, but in fact she was very supportive of these recommendations and seemed to be very sophisticated. Two members of the Senate, Harold Hughes from Iowa and Jacob Javits from New York, again, they were pretty progressive when they were senators, so they gave us some hope, and indeed it was hope that turned out to be accurate. Not only did they support decriminalizing marijuana, but after the commission's report was out, the two of them joined NORML's advisory board and gave us enormous credibility for a number of years to have two sitting U.S. senators on our advisory board. There were two other members of Congress, Tim Lee Carter from Kentucky and Paul Rogers from Florida. I'd have to say they fit the mode that we sort of anticipated. They were Southerners who were not about to do or say anything that indicated they were soft on drugs. And so I think they had to be brought around. I think they were not initially in favor of the recommendation of the commission, were finally convinced to do it as long as the commission was willing to make a few compromises, such as including a $100 civil fine and things like that for public smoking.
Dr. Thomas Ungerleider, who is currently Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at UCLA, was on the Schaefer Commission and helped craft the final report along with his colleagues. His previous work with folks experimenting with psychedelics in California had attracted the attention of those forming the commission.
Apparently so. I was working with LSD. We saw a lot of adverse reactions here in Southern California. Timothy Leary was out here, and when people started having bad trips, they brought them to UCLA Medical Center for some reason, and Timothy Leary was inviting me out to see what was going on out in Orange County up in the hills, where he had a couple hundred disciples and where they would take LSD. So I went out and gave psychological tests to these people and had a chance to see some of the reasons behind the adverse reactions that we were getting at our medical center in psychiatry. I was running a ward at the time, and I suspect that background had some effect and reason for me being appointed to the commission. They were concerned about marijuana, and knowing that marijuana was a psychedelic by some classifications, just like LSD, I think they assumed that I would be very negative and very worried about the effects of marijuana, just as I was with LSD, and that was the kind of input they were looking for at the commission at that time.
When Dr. Ungerleider was contacted about the commission, this is how it was described.
Well, basically to take a look at marijuana use throughout the world, and particularly in our country, to see what the effects were and what the best social policy would be, whether we should have a pure prohibition or pure legalization or somewhere in the middle. That was the charge, basically.
And when it came to marijuana, Los Angeles in 1972, much as it is today, was a prime location.
Well, I had been seeing, as a psychiatrist who was subspecializing in drug abuse, I was seeing a lot of kids, teenagers, who were using marijuana as well as a mixture of marijuana with other drugs. So I was pretty well informed about marijuana, and I knew what it was, and I knew some of the problems and concerns that parents had. I had seen, and I knew marijuana was not a benign substance, particularly in young people. So I saw that, but I saw that from an individual patient population study that I had as a private practitioner at UCLA. So I knew that it was not harmless, but I also felt that the question of should people be locked up for possession of marijuana, should they be arrested for possession, that seemed like a huge waste of resources, which it turned out to be. And so we went around the country and had hearings and met with a lot of health professionals, law enforcement, the old Bureau of Narcotics, the predecessor of the DEA. They were our guides on many of our trips. And we went all over the world looking and trying to find out how other countries handled this problem or didn't handle this problem.
There seemed to be some sense in the early 1970s that a practical approach could be found for marijuana, and everyone seemed to be recognizing that, even government and elected officials. Keith Strupp formed NORML around the same time, and Keith testified before this commission. I asked him how important the Schaefer Commission was to the history of NORML.
Well, I think it was important both for NORML, but even on the bigger stage, I think the Marijuana Commission report, when it was issued, sort of signaled the official end of reefer madness in America. Prior to this report, you could occasionally find an expert who would say that they thought marijuana wasn't such a bad thing and maybe we ought not to treat it as a crime, or at least we shouldn't treat it as such a serious crime. But for everyone that said that, there was another reefer madness advocate out there that was saying that it was a gateway drug, and if you smoked a joint, you'd end up being a heroin addict, or it caused crime and violence. I mean, there were some amazing allegations that were pretty prominently circulated around, and it was difficult to change public policy because it was almost impossible for an average person to reach a rational conclusion. Is marijuana terribly dangerous, or is it not? Well, the Marijuana Commission put an end to that largely, and so I think it was responsible for ending reefer madness and allowing us to at least enter a period where we could discuss the subject rationally.
In our digital age, it's almost hard to imagine the level of control the government had over their message and public relations every day. And the misinformation about marijuana had spread like a tidal wave of quicksilver. Dr. Ungerleider describes his biggest surprise in working with the commission.
Well, one of the big surprises was how much mythology there was about the fact that this drug would be taken and used and could be misused and could affect people so severely. And we found that throughout the world, they'd made adaptations to this. And in many places, there was de facto legalization, where people would use it and people would not have problems, and it would not be a real problem at all. But we were concerned to see how those models might be helpful or not helpful to what was going on in America. We found really that looking at our statistics and things, we found that marijuana was not a threat to the health, welfare, or safety of our nation.
But again, there seemed to be an amazingly expectant atmosphere of hope. Among the commissioners, there was a sense of moving forward with a policy that would at the same time grant Americans the freedom we deserve as hard-working citizens and protect Americans from the harms of misinformation, and especially protect us from senseless incarceration.
Well, we hope to raise the awareness of this, and we hope that states themselves would adopt some of these provisions, and indeed about 11 states with about a third of the population in the country did modify, based on our work, did modify their attitudes and legal policies towards marijuana. So that was kind of a good thing. And I think some of the people initially had no idea about marijuana, some of the commissioners who were not in medical areas. And they would say, well, we hear that in Morocco they lock people up and they have dungeons, and that seems to help. So we would go over there in Morocco, and of course they would say, what are you talking about? We don't do that at all. So we were able to dispel the myths about it for the commissioners. In fact, we named the report Marijuana Signal of Misunderstanding. And that is just as true today, I think.
When that final report was publicly issued on March 22nd, it seemed that those misunderstandings could be dealt with, that marijuana could move away from Schedule 1 in the CSA at least. The Controlled Substances Act was a brand new concept. Alcohol prohibition had required a constitutional amendment, but drug prohibition was moving forward without that fundamental step as a bureaucratic process. The Commission's report was part of that process and included some surprisingly pragmatic recommendations.
As the year evolved and we'd been to several hearings and I testified myself, I began to realize that this Commission had some real potential, that they may be willing to honestly charge some new ground here. So we had really convinced ourselves there was a possibility that there might be a majority-minority. We weren't certain there would be a total agreement, and we were hoping, frankly, that they would recommend some sort of a legally regulated system for marijuana, something like an alcohol system, but would have age controls and quality controls, and consumer would not have to buy the marijuana from a black market. So initially, we were a little discouraged by the report because it didn't go that far. But after a few days of kicking it around, our board of directors recognized that it was a large, giant step forward, and even though it didn't go as far as we wanted, it was nonetheless an incredibly important report, because what it did was, and again, they ended up with unanimous support for this, it recommended that the personal possession and use of marijuana and the transfer of not-for-profit transfer of small amounts of marijuana between adults should be perfectly legal. That is, no penalty whatsoever. So the idea that a marijuana smoker should not be treated like a criminal really was a significant step forward, and it is the essence of what NORML has been about since we founded the organization in 1970.
The Commission had conducted its hearings, travels, and research. Members of the Commission had visited all the states, had worked in chorus with law enforcement, and would recommend in their report, in the full consensus of all involved, that Congress amend federal law so that the use and possession of marijuana would no longer be a criminal offense. State legislatures, the Commission added, should do likewise. The following is a standout quote from that final report. Quote, "The criminal law is too harsh a tool to apply to personal possession, even in the effort to discourage use. The actual and potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal law into private behavior, a step which our society takes only with the greatest reluctance." Close quote. But Nixon had already decided, even before the Commission was active, that he wasn't going to take any of their future recommendations if it meant moving marijuana away from Schedule 1. His mind was already made up, and on March 21, 1971, the chair of the Commission, Raymond Schaefer, went to the White House to speak with the President before the public release of their report the next day. Keith Strupp has now seen the transcripts of those White House meetings and others related to the Schaefer Commission.
I think what's fascinating about those transcripts is to hear former President Nixon's total disregard of the commission. He didn't respect them at all. He was rude in the manner he discussed the commission, and he wouldn't even have the commission over for an official ceremony or press conference when they handed in the report, which is the usual way those things are done. He had former Governor Raymond Schaefer over, but the rest of the commission were not invited, and there was no press conference or anything else. The president issued a statement, I think, after he got it, basically saying that he would review it and look at it, but that he was not necessarily convinced by it, and of course, it turns out that he opposed it completely. He had thought that this was going to be a commission that was simply going to do his political bidding, and I think he was terribly upset that he lost control of it. Governor Schaefer seemed to me to be a man who was sort of caught in the middle, because on one hand, he was a really honorable man. He had a couple of kids himself who I think were college age at that time, so I suspect he was familiar with the fact that a lot of people were smoking marijuana in America, and a lot of them were good, productive citizens. So I think he personally understood that we had to do something to decriminalize marijuana, but on the other hand, he didn't want to say that specifically to President Nixon, because that he would have probably been dismissed as a commission chair at that point. So when he talked to Nixon, he made it sound as if on those tapes that he was sort of in a conspiracy with the president to make sure that nothing good came of this commission, but in fact what I heard from many of the commissioners was he was a very positive force in the commission and helped achieve that compromise decision.
Dr. Ungerleider as well has heard the White House Nixon tapes and read the transcripts as they've been released, declassified, and reported on in the media. Some of those tapes offered some revelations.
And actually, what the biggest surprise that I had just occurred several years ago when they took and declassified some of the things that President Nixon was saying about us. And for example, 1 month after we were appointed, before we even began, he was talking to some of his chiefs, talking pretty negative things about all the people investigating this. But then we knew, you see, this was a national commission on marijuana and drug abuse. It was not a presidential commission. So here was the Congress mandating this commission, and the president, the reluctant president, had to appoint people from both political parties. So we were really, his cards were stacked against us no matter what we found.
When I woke up this morning and found the troops were here.
It has always been an army occupation here.
We have to maintain law and order, or we might as well be back in the jungle.
The ghetto is a jungle, always has been. Understand, you cannot cage people like animals and not expect them to fight back someday.
This has been part one of our Audio Stash exclusive special, commemorating the 35th anniversary of the final report issued by the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission. We have links for you to read the full Schaefer Commission report on our website today at normalaudiostash.com. I want to thank Keith Strupp, Alan St. Pierre, Paul Armentano, Dr. Tom Ungerleider, as well as our PodSafe artists found up at podshow.com who provided background music for our segments today, Pablo Perez, Male Function, and Andrew Thomas. We have links to everyone involved on our website today and our PodSafe artists at normalaudiostash.com. Make sure to tune in tomorrow, where we'll present some White House Nixon tapes never before broadcast.
Understand this. I am the origin. I am the origin. I am the pure fragrance in the earth and the brilliance in the fire. If 1,000 suns should rise all at once in the sky, I am the origin. I am the origin.
You've been listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow.
Sunshine in my life.
76% of Americans no longer support arresting and jailing marijuana smokers, and nearly as many support the medical patients having access to medical marijuana. And over 80% of our citizens now believe the war on drugs is an ineffective failure. So the question is, when will the government's misguided war on adult marijuana smokers finally end? When? Simple. When you and your like-minded friends, family, and coworkers get involved with an organization such as the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, also known as NORML. My name is Keith Stropp, and I founded the organization in 1970. Contact us at NORML, toll-free, 888-67-NORML, or by visiting the organization's up-to-date webpage at www.norml.org.